Hello, my name is Stuart Roberts. I'm one of the founders of Pitt Street Research. And with me today is Dr. Tim Oldham, who's the CEO of AdAlta, ticker 1AD. Tim, welcome to Stocks Down Under, Pitt Street Research.
Thanks, Stuart, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. Now, last year you were named as the new CEO of AdAlta. This is a company that's been around since about 2007. And it's pretty important in terms of, I think, where the antibody industry goes next. Talk to us about how iBodies originated and where they're sitting right now as state of the art.
So iBodies is our proprietary technology platform. iBodies are a unique family of therapeutic proteins, and they're characterized by a unique, long, flexible binding loop that allows them to bind to targets and receptors that are very difficult for traditional antibodies to hit. They're actually discovered from basic research into the shark immune system. They're a single domain antibody, which makes them simpler than a traditional antibody. And the key enabling discovery for AdAlta was the realization that we could actually humanize these, because there was a human protein that looked very, very similar to the shark scaffold. That, when we added and fused the long flexible binding domains to the human equivalent protein, led to our iBody scaffold. And we're now looking to exploit that platform and that unique structure to develop a whole range of drugs against difficult to drug targets.
Yeah, so what impressed me is the size of this thing. The basic scaffold is only about 10% of a full-sized IgG antibody. And I'm imagining that the binding sites don't add that much more as well. So you're talking a relatively tiny drug-like molecule, right?
That's right. The iBody scaffold itself is around about 14 kilodaltons, which compares, as you say, with anything from 100 to 200 kilodaltons for a traditional full IgG-based antibody. That has some advantages in the sense that it allows it to get into potentially places that a larger molecule can't. But it also means that we have absolutely enormous flexibility as to how we then modify and deliver that iBody binding domain. We can attach it to a traditional IgG domain. With our lead product AD214, we've chosen to use an FC fusion structure in order to extend half-life. Conceivably, we can make bispecifics, trispecifics, all sorts of other platforms from it. We know that there are single domain antibodies being approved that are essentially just the iBody structure themselves.
And what's beautiful about that is the big sucking sound you can hear in the background is about $70 or $80 billion worth of monoclonal antibody sales, an industry that you can disrupt with a product as flexible as what you're describing.
Yeah, we think so. I mean, antibodies have been an amazing introduction to the therapeutic armory over the last 20 or 30 years, but there's still targets that they can't hit in order to really modify disease. And our lead product, AD214, is a good example of that. We're the first product targeting a receptor called CXCR4 for fibrotic diseases.
Which people have been trying to target for years without success. You're having a lot more success than your predecessors did.
Well, I mean, folks have targeted CXCR4 in the past, and the small molecule target for CXCR4 is a product called Pyrexafor, which is used for stem cell mobilization.
Right.
But this is the challenge of going after CXCR4 for fibrosis. We really don't want to be mobilizing stem cells continuously in a patient that we have to treat for multiple years. And indeed, the small molecule Pyrexafor is only used for acute use. It's toxic over chronic use, which is what we need for fibrosis. So this really highlights the benefit and the flexibility of the iBody platform, is we can bind and block CXCR4 to inhibit the migration of fibroblasts, which are a key part of the fibrotic disease cascade, but we don't materially mobilize stem cells, which gives us the ability to block CXCR4, not inhibit your usual stem cell mobilization, and have a chronic therapy.
Right. Now, fibrosis shows up in just about every chronic disease condition you care to name, but there's very few drugs that are effective against it. So you're pioneering more than just a small scaffold in the antibody-like drug space. The actual disease area that you're going to play some serious clinical games in is one that you're relatively new in, where there's a paucity of available treatment options, right?
That's right. So our lead indication for AD214 is a disease called Idiopathic Pulmonary Fibrosis. This is lung fibrosis. Fibrosis is essentially scarring of lungs. And when you get scarring of anything, it leads to stiffening and destruction of the normal tissue architecture, much as you do when you get scarring in your skin. The net result, of course, when that happens in the lungs is the lungs don't have the flexibility to enable the patient to breathe. So ultimately, this is a degenerative condition, and patients ultimately have extreme difficulties breathing, which leads to all sorts of other complications. IPF patients have an average lifespan of less than 4 years from diagnosis. There are only 2 marketed products approved for IPF. They sell between $2 and $3 billion a year in sales, and they only modestly improve or slow disease progression. They certainly don't reverse it, and most patients can't tolerate them for more than about 12 to 18 months. So there's a huge unmet need out there, and that's been reflected by enormous research in this space. We are the first company that's using the CXCR4 axis to attack fibrosis. There are multiple other ways that can be used to address the disease, but we're the first going after CXCR4.
And what's impressive to me is those drugs that you referred to. I think Roche and I think Boehringer are the 2 owners of those drugs, have basically pioneered the market that you can therefore easily enter now that people are willing to pay those sort of prices to get hold of the drugs in question.
That's right. Until pirfenidone and nintedanib were approved, people thought fibrosis was an untreatable condition.
Right.
At least these drugs opened a pathway to say, well, this might be possible. It's a bit like the first time a new cancer drug's approved in a new cancer. And it was thought to be intractable to disease, and then suddenly you get the first product through, and that unleashes the ability to think, maybe this is treatable after all. So certainly they've paved the way, but interestingly, they themselves realise that their drugs on their own are not going to be enough. Both companies are actively partnering to add additional mechanisms of action and additional drugs into their fibrotic pipeline. And of course, as you mentioned, the fibrosis disease is not confined to lungs. It happens in kidney, it happens in the heart, it happens in the liver, it happens in the eye, and the mechanism is broadly similar across all those organs. So we're not just looking at a $2 billion IPF market, we're looking at potentially a much, much larger market than that across multiple indications.
And so in the clinic, when do we expect to be dosing our first patient in the all-important IPF study?
Yeah, so we're currently on track to commence our phase 1 studies in the middle of 2020. We'll commence with a standard healthy volunteer single ascending dose program. That'll take us the best part of the rest of 2020. But importantly, we're now in a position to introduce patients into our phase 1 study. So traditionally, a phase 1 study is in healthy volunteers. We will be including patients in our phase 1 program from hopefully early 2021. And that's been enabled by a grant we were awarded at the end of last year to develop a radio-labeled version of AD214 that allows us to image it and its distribution and duration of the duration with which it stays on target in patients' lungs, because we haven't got a good biomarker otherwise. So that's enabled us to bring forward and get patients into our study, and that's really important because the target receptor that we're looking at is not expressed significantly in healthy patients, but it's massively upregulated in the lungs of IPF patients. So that key part of having patients is going to be enormously valuable for both clinical development of the product, but also for partnering.
Tim Oldham, thanks for taking the time. This is a very exciting program. I've watched it very carefully since the IPO a few years ago, and now set for its day in the sun. So well done. Keep up the good work.
Thanks very much, Stuart. It's good to talk.